I didn't ruin my life by being selfish. I ruined it by being good. Good the way people mean when they nod approvingly. Good the way that doesn't interrupt anyone else's plans. Good the way that keeps things calm, predictable, manageable. I learned early that being good meant not asking for too much and not needing too loudly. So I practiced. I practiced being agreeable. Being understanding. Being the one who adapts instead of the one who resists. I told myself this was maturity, that friction was childish, that wanting more than your share was something you outgrew. People noticed. They always do. They said I was easy to be around. That I didn't complicate things. That I was reliable, considerate, thoughtful. Those words felt like medals at first. Proof that I was doing life correctly. I wore them proudly. What I didn't notice was how often good meant silent. How often it meant swallowing reactions before they fully formed. How often it meant editing myself in real time so no one else would feel uncomfortable. I wasn't lying. I was just never telling the whole truth. At first, the cost was negligible. Small disappointments. Minor resentments that faded quickly. I assumed everyone made these trades. That this was the quiet compromise adulthood required. But good behavior compounds. Every time I chose harmony over honesty, it got easier. Every time I deferred, I reinforced the pattern. I became skilled at anticipating what others needed and arranging myself accordingly. It felt efficient. Clean. Moral. I didn't realize I was outsourcing my identity. I stopped asking myself what I wanted and started asking what would cause the least disruption. The second question always had an answer. The first one began to feel vague, unnecessary, almost indulgent. Wanting things seemed selfish. So I trained myself not to want too strongly. Over time, I became very good at disappearing politely. I showed up on time. I did what was expected. I avoided conflict with surgical precision. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. My life moved forward without visible damage. Inside, something thinned. It wasn't sadness. Not exactly. It was a kind of lightness that didn't feel freeing. More like a lack of weight. Experiences didn't anchor themselves in me. Days passed without leaving marks. I functioned, but I wasn't accumulating anything I could recognize as my own. I told myself this was contentment. Contentment is a convincing disguise. The first moment of doubt came unexpectedly. Someone thanked me for always being so understanding. They said it warmly, with genuine appreciation. I smiled automatically. And then, for a split second, I felt a sharp, irrational anger. It scared me. I pushed it down immediately, embarrassed by it. Gratitude doesn't deserve anger. Praise doesn't deserve resistance. But the feeling lingered long enough for me to notice it. It wasn't anger at them. It was grief. Grief for something unnamed, something I had been giving away so consistently that I hadn't noticed it was finite. The realization passed quickly, but it left a residue I couldn't ignore. I began to notice how often people spoke for me without checking. Not maliciously confidently. They knew what I would be okay with. They knew I wouldn't object. They knew I would adjust. They were right. That was the problem. I had trained everyone, including myself, to expect my compliance. Good people don't make scenes. Good people don't push back. Good people don't prioritize themselves when others are counting on them. I had confused goodness with absence. At night, alone, I sometimes replayed conversations and imagined what I could have said differently. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just honestly. Those imagined words felt foreign in my mouth, like a language I had studied but never spoken. I wondered when honesty had started to feel dangerous. The question unsettled me because I didn't have an answer. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was afraid of being seen as difficult, as selfish, as someone who took up space without permission. Goodness had given me moral cover, and the idea of stepping outside it felt like betrayal. Betrayal of who? That question followed me quietly. I began to sense that my goodness had a shadow. That beneath the calm surface was a slow erosion I hadn't consented to consciously. I wasn't choosing myself less, I was choosing myself last, so often that last had become never. The breaking point didn't come as a crisis. It came as a sentence I caught myself thinking one evening, without drama or exaggeration. If I disappeared, things would still work. Not emotionally. Functionally. The systems I supported would adjust. The roles I filled would be redistributed. Life would continue. Smoothly. Efficiently. I realized then that I had made myself replaceable by design. Goodness had taught me how not to matter. That thought didn't make me want to rebel. It made me want to understand how I had arrived here without noticing. Because somewhere along the way, being good had stopped being a choice and become a rule I no longer remembered agreeing to. And I was beginning to suspect that following it would cost me more than breaking it ever could. Being good stopped feeling like a virtue the day it began to feel mandatory. I noticed it in my body first. A tension that appeared whenever I considered saying no. A quick, sharp anxiety that rose before I had even formed the words. It wasn't fear of consequences, it was fear of judgment. Of stepping outside the role people expected me to play. Goodness had become my uniform. I realized how deeply I depended on it when I imagined removing it. The thought made me feel exposed, almost indecent. Who was I if I wasn't accommodating, if I wasn't reasonable, if I wasn't the one who smoothed things over? Those questions didn't feel philosophical. They felt threatening. I began paying attention to how often I edited myself mid-thought, how frequently I softened opinions, reframed needs, downgraded discomfort. Not because anyone demanded it explicitly, but because I had internalized a rule that said, good people don't burden others with their truth. That rule governed everything. I felt it when I wanted rest but offered help instead. When I needed clarity but said it's fine. When I felt hurt but smiled and explained it away. Each time, I felt a small internal recoil, followed by relief. Relief is seductive. It rewards you immediately. It tells you that you've avoided conflict, preserved harmony, maintained your moral standing. It never tells you the cost until much later, when the accumulation becomes impossible to ignore. The resentment surprised me most. I didn't think I was the kind of person who resented others. I prided myself on understanding, on empathy. But resentment crept in quietly, disguised as fatigue. As cynicism. As a vague irritation that flared when people asked for one more thing. I hated myself for feeling it. Good people aren't resentful. Good people give freely. So I doubled down. I became even more helpful, even more flexible. I told myself that the resentment would disappear if I just tried harder to be generous. That my discomfort was a sign of insufficient virtue, not a warning. But resentment doesn't disappear when ignored. It sharpens. It began turning inward. I criticized myself relentlessly for feeling tired, for feeling trapped, for wanting space. I told myself I was ungrateful. That others had it worse. That my life was fine. Fine became the word I hid behind. The moral dilemma tightened then. I saw it clearly for the first time, and it terrified me. Choosing myself would make someone else uncomfortable. Saying no would disappoint. Setting boundaries would disrupt. And disruption felt immoral. I had built my identity around being harmless. The idea that my needs might inconvenience others felt like an ethical failure. I believed that goodness required self-erasure, and that anything else was selfishness dressed up as self-care. I didn't question that belief because it had been rewarded my entire life. People trusted me. Relied on me. Praised my character. I had social proof that I was doing the right thing. That proof made it nearly impossible to admit that something was wrong. Who complains about being good? The psychological strain began to show in strange ways. I felt numb during moments that should have mattered. I felt irritated by small requests and guilty about it immediately. I oscillated between emotional flatness and sudden, inexplicable waves of sadness. I told myself I was just tired. But rest didn't help. I started fantasizing about being alone in ways that scared me. Not lonely, unreachable. A place where no one expected anything, where my absence wouldn't require explanation. The idea felt shameful and relieving at the same time. That contradiction forced me to look closer. I realized that my goodness had become conditional, it depended on my invisibility. As long as I didn't assert myself, I was good. The moment I imagined doing so, I felt the weight of possible disapproval. What if they think I've changed? What if they think I've become difficult? What if they think I'm not who they thought I was? Those questions mattered to me more than my own exhaustion. That was the moment I understood how trapped I was. I wasn't being good because I wanted to. I was being good because I was afraid of losing the identity it gave me. Without it, I didn't know how to be valued. Goodness had become my currency. I paid with silence. With patience. With the slow surrender of my inner life. And like all currencies, it demanded more the longer I used it. The breakdown didn't come with tears or shouting. It came with a quiet realization that I had not once asked myself whether my goodness was consensual. Whether I was choosing it freely, or whether I was obeying a rule I had absorbed too early to remember. That realization made something inside me snap, not violently, but decisively. I saw the future stretching forward if nothing changed. More compliance. More praise. More erosion. A life where I would be admired for my kindness and quietly resentful for my invisibility. I saw myself becoming gentle and bitter at the same time. That image frightened me more than being seen as selfish ever could. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider an unthinkable possibility, that being good might not be the same as being honest. That morality might require more than harmlessness. That choosing myself might not make me bad, just visible. The fear didn't disappear. But a new question began to form beneath it, steady and insistent. What kind of goodness requires you to disappear? The first time I broke the rule, nothing dramatic happened. No one yelled. No one walked away. No catastrophe followed. And that, somehow, was the most destabilizing part. I had expected punishment. Rejection. A clear sign that choosing myself meant becoming someone worse. Someone less kind. Less worthy. I had built my entire moral framework around the idea that goodness was fragile, that one wrong move would shatter it. Instead, the world barely noticed. What noticed was me. I said no to something small. Not defiantly. Not with an explanation prepared in advance. Just no, quiet, unembellished, unsoftened. The word felt heavy in my mouth, like it didn't belong there yet. I waited for the familiar rush of guilt. It came, but it didn't last. What followed was something I hadn't felt in years, relief that didn't require disappearance. Relief that didn't come from smoothing things over or absorbing discomfort on someone else's behalf. Relief that came from alignment. That terrified me. Because it meant my suffering had never been necessary. It meant I hadn't been protecting others from harm, I had been protecting myself from visibility. From the risk of being seen as complex, limited, inconvenient. Being good had kept me morally safe. It had also kept me small. Once that realization took hold, I couldn't unsee the pattern. I noticed how often I had mistaken compliance for kindness. How frequently I had confused silence with compassion. How easily I had accepted a version of morality that asked nothing of others and everything of me. That version of goodness was comfortable for everyone but the person living inside it. I began to understand that I hadn't been afraid of being bad. I had been afraid of being real. Real people disappoint. They change their minds. They take up space. They have limits that collide with other people's expectations. Goodness, as I had practiced it, avoided all of that by asking me to disappear politely. But disappearing is not a virtue. The next few times I chose myself, the guilt returned sharper, louder. Years of conditioning don't dissolve quietly. My body reacted as if I were breaking a law. Tight chest. Restless thoughts. The old inner voice accusing me of selfishness. I listened to it without obeying. That was new. I didn't argue back. I didn't justify myself. I let the accusation exist and acted anyway. And slowly, something shifted. The voice lost its authority. It became a habit rather than a truth. Some people noticed the change. A few reacted with confusion. They asked if I was okay. If something was wrong. If I was stressed. I realized they were trying to understand why I no longer behaved the way they expected. That expectation had been my prison. A small number of people didn't like the new boundaries. They preferred the old version of me, the one who didn't complicate things, who adjusted quietly, who made their lives easier without asking for anything in return. Letting those relationships strain hurt more than I expected. But not as much as staying invisible had. What surprised me was how many things didn't fall apart. How many systems adjusted. How many people adapted without resentment once I stopped assuming my needs were unacceptable. The world had not required my erasure to function. Only I had. I didn't transform into someone selfish or harsh. I didn't stop caring. In fact, I cared more clearly. When I chose to help, it felt intentional rather than obligatory. When I said yes, it came from capacity instead of fear. Goodness, reclaimed this way, felt different. Heavier. Riskier. More honest. I started to feel again, not dramatically, not constantly, but distinctly. Anger showed up when something crossed a line. Sadness when something mattered. Desire when something pulled me forward. These emotions didn't make me reckless. They made me present. For the first time, my life began leaving marks. I won't pretend this was a clean redemption. There are days when I still default to being good in the old way. When I catch myself smoothing, minimizing, erasing reflexively. Those habits are deeply wired. But now I notice. And noticing changes everything. If you're listening to this because you've built your identity around being good, kind, accommodating, harmless, and something in you feels quietly depleted, hear this without accusation: goodness that costs you your voice is not goodness. It's fear dressed up as morality. You don't become bad by choosing yourself. You become visible. And visibility is uncomfortable when you've spent a lifetime being praised for disappearing. I spent my life being good, and I lost myself quietly. Not because anyone demanded it, but because I believed that goodness required sacrifice without consent. Letting go of that belief didn't make me less kind. It made my kindness chosen. I no longer want to be good at the cost of being real. I no longer want to be praised for how little space I take. I no longer want a morality that asks me to vanish politely. I want to live a life where goodness includes me. Even when it's inconvenient. Even when it disappoints. Even when it makes me harder to categorize. Because a life built on being good but never being seen is not a virtuous life. It's just a quiet one. And I don't want to disappear anymore.